You know, I really want to congratulate you on bringing together a diverse panel. It's also the first panel I've ever sat on at USC about justice, outside of Manuel Pastor's activities. And so that in of itself is, you know, good. You know, thank you for that, Raphael. Secondly, getting back to this idea of talking about justice and being political, you know, our students sometimes, you know, will say to me, I teach a class on social justice, they're like, yeah, there are so many definitions of social justice, it's not a basis for policy. You know, we just can't do it. You know, what's the point of even pursuing it? And the problem with that gets back to this sort of political idea, is that most of politics are discussions about justice. Many people have ideas about justice. There's the question of protecting property rights as a matter of justice. There's a question of promoting economic equality, or at least changing the disparities, providing people with basic goods. Virtually all political conflicts at their heart are about justice, not about efficiency. The policy rubric that we spend a great deal of time talking about in our school, right? And so when you think about things from a justice standpoint, and you think about politics in that way, it preoccupies a great deal of our time in the political realm. So now that we sort of kind of bring this home in terms of developing it at USC, you know, the University Village development, the Expo line, the displacement that you just talked about really helps us enlighten the conundrums at the heart of trying to create a good citizen presence for USC in the community. You know, there's probably not a single person on the planet Earth who wants to keep university theaters the way it is. You know, it's a bad facility. People in the community would like an amenity. You know, and the bottom line is that places change. Communities change, particularly when you end up with a nice public amenity like the Expo line, right? We want to be able to leverage that. One of the things that theory teaches us over and over is that we want to be able to use that high value land intensively, right? But then when the markets come in and you start to have that raising land values, of course people who don't have as much money to compete in this very competitive market around USC get displaced. And those are exactly the same people we want to be able to patronize public transit, right? And so then we get into these questions about how would we enable them to stay in the community? Well, what about changing zoning? What about providing more infill? What about more density? And then we start to look at that and we can see that affordable housing really becomes one of the keys to unlocking these puzzles, right? But affordable housing isn't just USC's rubric. Who else needs to become engaged? How do we start to pull in partners? We have a whole bunch of policy goals that we're trying to accomplish here. Of course we want our students living close to campus. A humongous amount of resources at the federal, state, and local level have been expended to try to minimize commutes, right? We want people living next to their jobs. Well, of course, that's going to displace people who don't necessarily work here or go to school here, but these are longtime residents. And they have entitlements to, you know, trying to make that social change as beneficial to them as possible. And so at the Price School, basically, we sit in planning and policy and public administration at the juncture of all these fields where these tensions about justice come into play. And at this level, right, the choices get very hard, and we have to spend a lot of time thinking carefully about what we're doing.
So let me jump right onto that, and choices and the trade-offs that are faced. And Paulina, we just went through a university village, we'll call it an experience, or a process, whereby the first public foray that USC made went up in flames. And subsequently, the most recent one went up and everyone had roses and they were hugging and kissing. There was a transformation there in terms of trade-offs and hard choices. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what kind of thresholds were you looking for or was the community looking for in that engagement for viewing USC as a full partner?
So I would say it's the community. Part of what SAGE does is organizing and ensuring that residents have the tools necessary to be able to go to City Hall and express their opinions and experiences and advocate for what they believe needs to happen. So with University Village, the community residents and the organizations working on this project felt like we've never been against development. Development can be good, communities change, and they can bring good investment and resources to a community, and University Village could and will do that. But there were some questions about what are the risks that come along with that, or what are the potential consequences of displacement that come along with that. And so we always engaged in a conversation when we said, this development needs to move forward. It's going to create jobs. It's going to create 12,000 jobs, as somebody reminded me earlier. It's going to create mostly union jobs, and that's all good. But we also want to make sure that it creates, enough student housing to alleviate some of the demands, that it creates an affordable housing trust fund that could actually be then go back into the communities to preserve and create affordable housing. We knew that we didn't want to, nor were we going to try to stop this development, even though it potentially will have some gentrifying pressures in the community. But we knew that there was a way to actually work with the university to ensure that it benefited the local community and students as a whole. And so, we proposed a lot of things. We proposed, a community space at University Village. We proposed a tenant clinic that would that would take place at the law school. We proposed affordable housing. I think our original number was something like $30 or $40 million, and we ended up with $20 million. All of this is a negotiation. There are trade-offs that happen, and then the community has to be involved in every step of the way. Development often happens in the city in this way. It happens at the city council and the developer decide what's going to happen. They announce it to the community, and then they defend from any opposition or any concerns that the community has. And really what should be happening is that the community should be involved in the beginning stages of that, be able to say, this is the kind of investment we want, development we want, or if it's happening, these are the concerns we have, and be able to mitigate those impacts. That's what we try to do with University Village. It did end up where we were in hearings, and there were proponents of the project and those that were raising concerns. Somebody mentioned earlier that there were pitchforks. I don't think that there were pitchforks at those hearings. But
it didn't go well.
Well, it was a difficult process, right? We were saying the concerns of the community around displacement, around jobs, are not being mitigated. They're not being addressed by what's being put forward, and these are the ways you can address them. And the council then, met with the university. We continued to talk to the university and try to find ways to mitigate those. And when they were mitigated to the best of anybody's ability, we said, we can live with this. We think this will actually do what we hope it will do, and we supported it going forward.
Thank you. Leslie, what should a university do in terms of these sorts of social justice issues, and how should a university engage its neighbors in partnership? I'm just throwing out a question out there.
That's a big question. So this is one thing. This panel, bringing us together in this space to talk about the issues, is one thing that the university can do. The great gift of having an educational system that allows, all of us, despite our economic background, despite our racial background and political background, to come into the same room and share ideas, is a powerful, powerful way to shift policy, to shift culture, to make decisions. So that's one thing, to convene people, which we're doing today. Another thing that the university can do is involve the community in that conversation. When we're talking about community organizing, we're not talking about me coming with the answers and telling you what to do. When we're talking about community organizing, what SAGE is doing is bringing people together who have power already, but have been told or have learned through the course of their life that their power is not credible or that they don't have enough. And bringing that community together here with the university and believing their stories, believing the authenticity of their experience, understanding that the role community members play in shaping a city is a valuable one to the university. If you have, for example, if you have a large immigrant population, there's a great deal of energy and creativity in the immigrant communities in Los Angeles, entrepreneurial spirit, a desire to be part of the civic fabric. If we look back at the recent campaign for Prop 30 here in California, on the east side, there was a huge upswelling of power in the people who all came out, not necessarily because they had the power to vote, but they had a vested interest in the outcome of the election. Even if they couldn't vote themselves, they could help persuade the way people would think simply by coming together and having a conversation. So I think that the university can partner with community organizers, with nonprofits, with foundations like Liberty Hill, to really bring the voice of the people and the voice of the academy together so that we can think creatively about how we can share this space, how we can mutually benefit from each other's presence without being threatened by one another.
So let me, I'm going to be a little provocative. So, I've heard all three of you say at one level that these are people who don't have a voice, who don't have power, who don't know, who don't believe that they could. You said they don't believe that they have power, and they don't know their own power. And I'm wondering if we could unpack that a little bit. I mean, these are people who have been in community, at least in the USC area, for decades. These are families that are longstanding here. What is it that hasn't happened? Why have they, I mean, do we think is that they don't know they have power, or are they not playing out, they're not acting on that power, or are they, is the system trying to find ways around them? Let's start with Lisa, but I'll leave it. I have a feeling that this is triggering thoughts for all of you, and I want to get to all of them.
Well, I'm going to be short because I didn't actually say that, and we have tape proof. I think I just want to amplify a couple of points that Leslie made in the light of what you just said. I try to teach my students in planning theory that the conflicts that we go through in development are not bad, right? That the adversarial process that occasionally emerges between a large developer and the surrounding community is usually, it can often be very productive, both for the developer and the community. Conflict is expensive, it's annoying, it holds you up, but when you've had that conversation, sometimes you end up building things together with the people who are your neighbors. You get to know them better, they irritate you, you maybe met them for a little bit, but the bottom line is that conversation, even if it starts out with snarking at each other, can actually be very productive for everybody. We work in a system where there are property rights and land exchanges and all of these other things, but your property is valuable in and of itself in the context that it's in. Just as you said, your neighbors provide value, and your neighbor, even if it's a corporation or a developer or whatnot, that's something that's contributing to your space, or it's not contributing to the degree that it could be. And the same thing is true. When you place something in a community, those are your customers. Those are the people that you're going to be working with every single day, and that are going to be your retail buyers or your leasers or your renters or whatever. And so having that start from a position of annoyance to reconciliation through a process of a negotiated settlement of how we do development, I don't want my planning students to think that that's necessarily a bad thing, and I don't want my real estate students to think it's a bad thing. It's kind of the way stuff happens, and you got to suck it up and deal with it. Now, in terms of do we think the community has power? Power is not like a cake, where if I have some, you have less. There are all sorts of ways in which power can be taken away, brought together, it can be synergized. It's very clear in the development process that sometimes communities win, outright win, and trump whatever the proposal is, and sometimes they outright lose. And I don't think that there's one story that can be told about community and power and development. And so with that, I hope I bought you guys enough time to be able to answer the question.
I have a story on why I thought I didn't have power.
Go on, Leslie.
Okay. It's hard to stop me, isn't it?
Oh no, it's all right.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear Leslie?
No?
Can you?
Louder? Louder? Okay. So I'm going to give an example of why I thought I didn't have power. And I'm not going to say that this is true for everybody who's an African American woman, but it's true for me, and maybe it will be resonant with some of you. I used to live in downtown Long Beach, very mixed economic community, very mixed racial community. I lived by public transportation, by the Blue Line, and I rented a condo. In our building, I think there are about 40 units. Many of the units were owned by individual people and then sub-rented to people like me. I was in law school at the time. I, among many people renting in the space, was able to stay there through the collapse, through the economic collapse. I didn't lose my apartment. I was able to keep paying rent. My landlord didn't raise the rent. And so many of those 40 units stayed inhabited and the owners were able to pay their mortgage because they had renters. There were several units, 5 in one day, in fact, that were owned by people who were not renting them to anyone. They got 5 foreclosure notices in one day. People who had invested, this is not the best neighborhood in Long Beach, it's not the worst. These were people who were probably around my age trying to start their first home, who'd invested $200,000 to $400,000 buying 1-bedroom condos in a rehabilitated 1920s brick building. And they lost it all. They lost their money that they'd invested and more than the value of the property. And it was devastating for them individually. One owner committed suicide. It was devastating in our building. She was a beautiful person. And so the power that I didn't know that I had was as a renter. As a renter, I helped stabilize my unit for my landlord. All the people who rented in that building helped stabilize that building simply by being renters. It's not a kind of power that took something from someone else. We actually gave resources. As low income, as moderate income, we helped stabilize downtown Long Beach during the economic crash. And I think for me, that was a shift in my understanding of my power. It wasn't that I took something from my landlord. My landlord was a police officer, and I wasn't to be a public defender. We had different ideas about the world, but there was something that we were sharing, a space. She was sharing it as an owner, I was sharing it as a renter, and together we helped stabilize, in a small part, that piece of real estate in Long Beach. So for me, that's a story of how I thought I didn't have power, but in fact I did have power. And the only way that I learned about it was I had to use it. I had to see it. I had to see my neighbors lose their homes. I had to see my neighbors lose their lives because they didn't have the property. They didn't have the dream. And I did because I was renting from someone. So I think for people who think or believe that they've been silenced by their race or their gender or their position in terms of legal status, my opinion is that's a fiction. Every one of us has power. We have creativity, we have imagination, we have resources that we haven't even tapped into yet. And the belief that I'm powerless is one that I can lose. It's one that I can shift. It's one that can be transformed when I come into contact with somebody from SAGE, from somebody from USC, from somebody in my life who believes that I also am valuable.
So let me just add
Let me answer
I'm going to let you get back in, don't worry. But I did want to just add an addendum to that, which is, we talk, there are a lot of implicit notions of where value is and what makes someone valuable. Home ownership has always been something that's been lifted up far more as the right way to be housed. And I think that got us into a lot of trouble. And what we've seen, hopefully it will continue, is a rebalancing of how we talk about getting people housed, where renting is okay, leasing is okay, owning is okay, co-oping is okay. As long as it's something that's sustainable for your situation and you can keep doing it as the fluctuations of life happen, that's what makes things work. So I think that's an important message, and the notion that there are a bunch of renters out there who think they're less than because they rent is problematic, and it's something that we continue to need to combat. All right, now.
So I do want to say that what I brought up earlier around the decide, announce, defend model actually does speak to a system in place in the city and in different levels of government that actually is not meant to naturally open up a democracy where everybody has an equal voice and everybody can have a say in what's going on. That's not the way it works. And there is a difference between power and organized power, between individual power and organized power. So my telling story, so now I got to tell the story, is my father worked in the garment industry when I was growing up. He was very upset about the way he was treated at work. He was often injured, he was paid very little, we had barely enough money to put food on the table. And so he started to organize within his company, and he got fired, right? That's very different than an organized workforce of workers organizing together who are on the same page, who have the same goals, have talked about their strategy, have talked about their demands, and made a plan to win And if one gets fired, they all go, or they're, they stand up for each other. There's a difference. So developers are very well organized. They have a lot of lawyers, they have a lot of architects and planners and, everything at their fingerprints. Low-income renters don't necessarily have that, right? In Beverly Hills or in Hollywood, often the same discussions are happening. In Beverly Hills, there was a fight about putting a tunnel underneath a school. And there were lawyers, and they're suing. And in South LA, we have at-grade transit that is very dangerous for pedestrians and for people on cars or on bikes. And there was, there's a difference in the way the fight is happening and how people organize themselves. And so when I talk about SAGE and Unidad working with the community to ensure that they have the tools, that the planning process, can anybody here, I don't know what you're studying, actually say that they understand the way planning works in the city of LA, how to impact it, and how to be able to get what you think is right and just through it?
I had better see my planning students start shaking.
You all better put your hands up, yes.
Can I just jump in here real quick? My planning students had to answer a question on where power comes from on their final, and I think, I didn't mean to leave the impression that we're all equal and we're all having a good time. I do think that communities can and do win, by the way. But the right answer to that question is, where does power come from? Is it comes from capital. It comes from wealth and the ability to hire professionals and to get information, right, and to gain access to decision. It comes from the state, right? We have, the government is the arena for these decisions, and when you control that arena, there are all sorts of things you can do to make it roll the way you'd like it to. And power comes from organizing, right? It comes from people, and that's one of the reasons why organization is so important, is that it is the answer essentially to power that derives from wealth or power that derives from the state.
All right. I'm going to do a little pivot. We talked a lot about neighborhoods in the abstract. We've talked a lot about University Village. I had mentioned the Expo line, and I wanted to make sure that we spent some time talking about that. What are the social justice issues around the Expo line, and how do you think they've been playing out? There's been so much emphasis on University Village, and those conversations have been in the press. There's been a lot on Beverly Hills, actually, and those have been in the press, and those have been interesting. It reminds me of Georgetown in Washington, D.C., which just tried to block the transit from going to their town, and they were successful, by the way. It reeks of that, but that's been very public. Expo line has been a little different, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts or reflections on that. And I'll leave that open to the panel. Paulina, you want to go first?
It's about to get interesting with the Expo line. The Expo line, I think, in all, as Los Angeles builds rail and tries to build density around transit stops, you have an issue of core transit riders are mostly those between $20,000 or less are actually bus riders. About $15,000 of income a year is a bus rider. For rail, it's higher than that, but it's still around, I think, $25,000 or $30,000 of income. So the problem is, and I think Lisa, you might have alluded to it earlier, when displacement happens in and around transit because of development that's happening related to it or not, you're displacing core transit riders, and you're having them move further away from the transit. At the same time, Los Angeles is cutting bus lines, because they're trying to save money and put money into rail, and so bus lines are being cut, and the bus lines that get you to the rail are now, it's a lot harder to find those services. So what ends up happening is we build luxury housing around transit, and luxury housing brings higher income earners who own cars and who take transit because maybe they want to today, maybe they don't want to today, right? So it actually doesn't equal smart growth if you're bringing car drivers into transit and displacing your core transit riders. So it's not only an economic justice issue in that those residents who are being displaced, those core transit riders, now have less access to infrastructure and to be able to get to their jobs and be able to get where they need to go, but now it's not even environmentally smart. So along the Expo line, the community plans are moving forward with the City of Los Angeles, and they are going to be talking about how do we zone around transit, What kind of development do we want around transit and to incentivize around transit? And many of the community residents who now have this tremendous victory and this new community benefit agreement and partnership with the university are going to be very involved in that discussion. Because as the community plans move forward, is there going to be protections for core transit riders to be able to stay here? We have a building right on the Expo line that is being sold, and the developer wants to demolish it and build student housing. Families live in that building right now, and actually students also. It's like half family, half students. But it's right on a transit stop, and it's prime real estate. That's going to be the first of many that are going to be in discussions going forward, and the community plans have a way to protect residents if done properly, or have a way to ignore it completely and allow this kind of displacement to happen.
Leslie or Lisa, you want to?
Anything you want to say?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you for considering. Sorry for coming.
Oh, you can. Everybody does.
Well, I think that this is a really, the question that you posed about Beverly Hills and the way that they've had access to the media, I think is a really good small point to fixate on. So having access to the media doesn't happen magically. It's a strategic process. You think about what message you want to bring, who your audience is, and how you want to reach them. Do you want to reach them through radio, television, print, web? Do you want to have a ground campaign? Do you want to have something visual? Do you want to have a brand? These are things that take creativity, money, resources, time. When a campaign happens in a community that has literacy, that has language, that has access to the networks of people who work in radio, film, television, it's a very different thing to build a communications plan or a PR plan. If you're in a community that doesn't have all of those resources at its fingertips, you can't pick up your cell phone and call somebody who's at the LA Times, right? You have to do maybe a couple of days of research to figure out who you would even call, what their phone number even is, get a computer, pay your phone bill before you can make, if you don't have that same kind of leverage to create an ad campaign, you're not going to be in the paper. So the fights around the Expo line that are happening in South LA that have been deep. The thoughts that have been going behind how can we make it so that we have a transit stop that's accessible to the people who live here and not just accessible to the people who want to go to the movie theater. Those conversations have been happening, and there have been a lot of resources put in from the people who are here, but they aren't necessarily showing up in print, radio, television the same way the Beverly Hills conversation is because of media campaign costs.
Just on that, I also think that, and I wish we were still with Annenberg Communication, because there's a question of what the media views as news and what neighborhoods are newsworthy versus not. And I think that's another dynamic in this mix as to sort of what they're willing to cover.
I'll jump in and I'll just say that communities can actually influence what the media.
Oh, they definitely do, but sometimes they don't have to. Right? Sometimes it'll happen anyway, and that allows them to use their resources for other things that can advance their interests.
Right.
Lisa, did you want to jump in Expo line?
Well, let me give you a little bit of an overview on why transit is important. Does that sound good?
Sure.
The reason why we should be worried about the displacement around transit stations that we're going to talk about is that, in talking about the sort of the basic goods in the city, social opportunities, economic opportunities in the city, one of the ways you can try to provide that to people is by making it happen in their neighborhoods, right? Well, the other way is which is really hard, right? You can't make everything happen in every place. And so for people to be able to get to jobs, to get to the places they want to go, transit is another one of those keys to the city, right? It opens up the opportunity. You do a good job of providing public transit, you create social and economic citizenship for people who can't afford to live right by the station, or can't afford to live right by downtown, or can't afford to live up the job center along Wilshire, right? But they have, if it works right, a pretty easy, cheap, fast transit trip. When transit doesn't work well, they have a crappy trip, all right? And good quality transit is unbelievably difficult to provide. This is a very difficult city to provide transit service in, even in cities where transit is widely loved and constantly talked about. Transit service is actually going down and not up. It's becoming less affordable, not more affordable. So even places like DC Metro, in New York, in San Francisco, the CTA in Chicago. All of these companies are so financially pressed that they're cutting lines and raising fares, right? BART used to be exemplary, but they've cut back on frequencies on BART, and so the service, even though it covers a whole bunch of the Bay Area, being less frequent, means that it's not the service that it was 5 years ago. And so if you are not going to provide public transit, that suddenly begins to sort of make the distinctions between which communities have what. It becomes much sharper and much more isolating of people who need to have access to jobs in particular at its most basic level. We'd also like people to have access to UCLA and other things, right, from the east side. So that's why transit is so crucial, and that's why it's so important that we have to figure it out. The worry that I have for Los Angeles is that we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars and the system is not necessarily improving. Metro is very, very deeply committed to building rail. Light rail is not as fast as commuter rail. There are ways in which if your light rail is slow, you can actually make it worse than with basic bus system, because you're introducing transfers, you're realigning bus routes and things like that. We established that with MARTA in Atlanta. And my concern is that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars and we're not going to get what we want out of the rail system that we're buying. And you know, for people who are big believers in rail, they say it's always an improvement. For those poor bus riders, we're taking them off a horrible bus and we're putting them on a shiny train. That's not necessarily true with light rail that operates in traffic. Let's experiment with it one day. I did this for 2.5 days. I took the Expo line up to downtown. I took 81 from downtown, and 81 beat it every single time. That is not what you want out of something you just spent $900 million on, right? And so I am deeply worried about the state of public transit in the United States, and I am gravely worried about it in Los Angeles. But I'm very hopeful that the voters are so willing to support it. I just hope that we're using their resources prudentially.
Well, I'm glad you did that test. I wonder about those sorts of things all the time, so it's good to hear about that. I think we should open it up to the floor. So if there are those in the audience who have questions, do raise your hand. And when you ask your question, please introduce yourself so we know who you are, and then speak loudly so that everyone in the room can hear it. I usually go closest to the stage first. So Marlon.
Marlon Barnett, I'm a professor, so etiquette would imply that I should stay quiet. So I could read that briefly. Lisa, you just said something that prompted a thought in my mind. A large part of the transit program is written into the various propositions, including Measure R. And so your point, which is very salient, is kind of a large caution. Is this a wise system? What about the idea that the response is the voters approved it? It can't be revisited, or we read the contract with the voters.
Well, that's a real problem, right? That's where we are with high-speed rail. What I would actually personally prefer is if Metro were to go forward with things that are based on performance standards. If you give us another half cent, what we're going to do in 10 years, everybody in LA County will be within a 10-minute walk of a service that comes every 10 minutes, right? And that takes the whole Claremont, hair-pulling, squabbling, holding voters hostage until I get my largely expensive, completely irrelevant rail line off the table with the political horse swapping that goes on, and puts it at the level of operations. And then lets people who actually know how to make the operations run make those kind of strategic capital investment decisions according to like where the service actually matters. So in places where it does make sense to invest heavily in capital investment, fine. But in places where you just have to meet that 10-minute goal, that 10-minute frequently goal, you just put buses on the road, right? And that's all there is to it. And it changes the dialogue away from we're going to spend money in this place to we're going to provide service in this place, which is different.
Are there other questions? Yes.
My name is Gerard Holland. I'm a doctoral student in the Price School studying university expansion across the country. My question is to the panel, as you look at university expansion, and I'll use LA for example, what do you think government's role as it weighs the needs and rights of its individual citizens versus the needs and wants and rights of the university? In the USC's case, the largest private employer in the what do you think government's role is balancing those very distinct demands of its constituents, particularly those that are disadvantaged and misrepresented, versus the city's largest private employer and largest economic driver?
So I think in the case of any development in the city, there has to be a role to ensure that, from the government, that ensures that it is done in a responsible way and doesn't actually harm, chemical plant or an oil refinery, or you're talking about a development of, the way USC is talking about it, which is very different. There are still impacts that result from development. Obviously, they're very different in those cases, but that there is a role to ensure that there's responsible development, that impacts are mitigated, that it bolsters a community rather than hurts it. That's my role, and I think both government and the university did that in the case of University Village.
And I just think, President, Jese brought up performance measures, and I think that that's one discrete thing that government can think about as it's interacting with citizenry, individual people, particularly low-income people of color, and with large institutions, corporations, nonprofits, to think about the tool of performance measurement as including the issue of justice and equity. Oftentimes when we use performance measure metrics, we're measuring things like money, we're measuring time, we're measuring human resource allocation, very quantifiable things, but the performance measurement movement has been challenged, maybe because of its inability or refusal, depending on how you come at it, to incorporate issues of equity, justice, and broader social justice issues and frameworks that it could incorporate. So I think one thing government can do is to connect with these expanding universities, with people who have actually studied performance measurement, and develop metrics that relate to social justice, relate to equity, relate to racial justice, and start to give information, training sessions to government staffers who are developing policies, who are making recommendations to their superiors about how to expand Expo line or university campus, and incorporate these tools into their daily practice. I mean, if you're going to incorporate a performance measure in the way you manage your staff, you might as well incorporate issues of justice, which often we don't do in a systematic way.
Lisa, did you want to add anything?
I'm actually more interested in Gerard's answer to this question, but one of the things I say to my planning students is that I think one of your jobs is to save the court's time, right? To try to help engage in a dialogue prior to before we all get into the court, right? And inevitably, with the big projects, or I used to work in infrastructure, and with big projects, you almost always get sued, right? You almost always do, and what you're trying to do there is you're trying to get sued over things where you really do need the court to sort it out, because the interests really just, there's not a negotiation, there's not a deal you can make. But if you do some of that groundwork in creating the arena for the discussion to happen prior to when people start suing you, those lawsuits can go faster. They resolve however they go, and a lot of the sort of things that can be hashed through in a way that people feel comfortable with, right? Justice being enacted in a context and in a moment for both sides can happen before you get there. And that's what I think one of the things that as planners, and they don't have to be government planners, they can be private sector, they can work for real estate companies or whatever, but part of their job is to try to help people get to a place where they're feeling pretty good about the development and how it's unfolding, before we get into the courts. Now, government in and of itself has a lot of different tools that are not just negotiated, right? We have infrastructure policy, which is the field that I worked in for years. And that's one way in which you do direct where it's possible and desirable to invest as a real estate developer, where it is possible. I mean, we're talking about private universities in this context, but when the state of California decided to place a campus is a big honking deal for economic development in particular communities. And so the government has a great deal of development that it does in and of itself. So it holds two different hats here. And that the conversation about campus and town and gown, and all these other things happens far more with a government institution than with private institutions. We just happen to be in a private one.
Other questions? Yes.
My name is Tomas Lopez. I'm a first-year Master of Planning student and panel member. recently about health and health policies. And with regards to transit-oriented development and health benefits, what do you guys see in terms of segregation of health benefits between communities? Yesterday we had a presentation on the LA River revitalization project, and almost all the development is occurring downtown right now. And the little development that's occurring in Bold Heights will probably lead to gentrification. So the people that are there now will probably won't get the benefits that come with a revitalized LA River. How does organizations like SAGE, for example, combat that when low-income communities usually have higher obesity indexes than regular communities? And what do you think the discussion in terms of health policies with regard to other sectors should, I guess, focus on?
So I think that was to me. I guess what I would say is two things. One, it's my sense that most development conversations don't think intersectorally like that, right? So the housers think about housing. They don't think about how small changes or different orientations can also have these extra health benefits. And part of, I think, what we've been trying to do is raise awareness and build new coalitions and allies to try to change the nature of those conversations. Now, the challenge is always to translate that from these sorts of places where we're having panel conversations to actual planning conversations. And the LA River and its redevelopment efforts has been a decades-long conversation, and I don't think this has really come up as part of that conversation to date. Never too late. And what I would expect is, and now that Paulina's here and has heard this, that we may start to have some different sorts of conversations about what sorts of things we should expect in our developments, and then where should we expect them as well. So, all these things there, we are in it's a moving river. It's actually probably poor imagery given the question, but it is one where the landscape is changing and will continue to change, and hopefully, at the end of the day, we don't. Actually, let me back up and say, there's been a general concern I've had that many of the sustainability features that go into things are only going to be realized for folks at the higher end of the income distribution because they're more expensive to do and all that. And so we wind up with an inequitable distribution of these benefits that we believe are important for everybody. And we need to have a more general conversation about how do we get these benefits to the people who, frankly, would benefit proportionally more from them so that we get more value added from the investments that we're making. And that's a conversation. I don't think we've found the silver bullet to get everyone on board with that, but that's kind of where we have to go.
Can I add something
Yeah.
to that? So, yes, in this area we have higher obesity rates, higher diabetes rates, right? Asthma, heart disease, all of that in South LA is elevated when you compare it to areas like West LA. We also have less access to fresh food. We have less access to parks and open space. It feels less safe in the community to go for a walk, right? So the Expo line actually is a development that could impact health. If you lower car pollution, maybe you can have an impact on lowering asthma. If you build walkable and bikeable streets, people can actually walk and bike and be healthier. But if the community that is suffering from these health disparities moves away from the infrastructure that you're building to build a healthier community, again, it's just dumb growth. It's not smart growth anymore, right? So there are ways we can impact health, and we should impact health through these different developments that are occurring right now. We're going to have that opportunity through the community plans, but only if we take these issues head first.
Two questions, but the first question is kind of broad. I'd love to hear your opinion, Mr. Busting, is about affordable housing. And given there's no CRA, given that block grants are getting cut at the federal level, and all other sorts of fiascos, what are some politically realistic scenarios for funding affordable housing? And two, this is like an anecdote that's kind of looking for a question, but I'd love to hear your response to this as kind of an example example of some of the obstacles to some of the justice and some of the dialogue that we've been extolling. Actually, in this room last year, Christina Rasky, the VP of Real Estate at USC, was talking about the University Village and all the amazing amenities that it would have. And it's, you know, faux Italian architecture with the brick and everything. And she's like emphasized that by saying that national tenants would not lease in the new University Village unless it was USC branded. And that I found intensely provocative. As in, like, because it would imply that if we're just like, oh, a normal place for people in the community to use, we don't want that. So how, if this is something that happens, how do you work around it?
I have a response to that, and that is, of course they want to University USC branded, and I can see why. But one of the things that I think is entirely possible and that USC is doing wrong at the moment, it loves to have criticisms from its associate professors, but is the notion that it is not part of the place that it's in, and that there is this sort of, you know, hardening of security around our periphery, right? You know, if the shootings last year of our 2 Chinese students should have taught us anything, it's that we're embedded here. And how safety is for the community around us is, you know, it's for us too, right? It affects us. It affects people's willingness to come here. It affects our ability to be a good, hospitable place for people around the world. And that our community neighbors are part of that equation. And that we don't necessarily want to create a thing at University Village that is surrounded by 20 feet tall hedges with big pokey thorns, and that only people who have university IDs are allowed to enter into. It's possible for our borders to be more porous. When I first came here, my favorite thing on campus was the basketball courts, where the students could play and where people in the community could play, and those are gone. And I think that is a mistake. Now, perhaps I'm wrong. I often am wrong.
Every now and then.
But this makes me uncomfortable, and it makes me unhappy, because even though I'm a university professor at a private university, I live in West Adams. I care about it as a place, and I think we should. And I think we should want our neighbors to care about us, and to care about what's happening on campus, and to be able to come to a concert here, even if they're not a student, and without getting hassled by our security. I don't know what the answer is, but I am pretty sure that gates and taking away basketball courts and making us more exclusive than our $50,000+ a year cost already makes us is probably not the answer.
So Lisa, there's a whole lot more to be said on that. we may have to amend our programming to have a session on
Gates.
USC's gates and their relation to the community. I think that would be very interesting. This has been a very, very interesting conversation. I wrote a lot, and I would just leave you with 6 thoughts that jumped out to me as particularly interesting. The first is the notion that the standard course of business for development is decide, announce, and defend. That's an interesting phrase and way to put it. Second, issues around where does power come from? Capital, the state, and organization of people. Those are principles I think are important to keep in mind. The third and my 6th are the same, so that will shorten us down, is this notion of displacement around transit. And if there's too much of it, then smart growth can become dumb growth, and we need to think about how we manage those transitions. And then the last 2. One is, how should we be managing change and growth? Right? What is the best way to approach that, and how should we be thinking about that at a neighborhood level? And then the last one, to put a nice bow on our conversation today, is, I want you all to think about, do we talk about justice enough? Right? Do we have these sorts of conversations that are transparent and unapologetic and open about the different interests and the reality that, you know, I like what you said, conflict isn't a problem. It isn't always bad. Sometimes that's how you get to a mutual solution. So with those things in your head, I would ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. You all have been wonderful, quite provocative.